Well, the purpose of this video is to talk about the world of poetry in its totality. Poetry can be very, very messy, and it can be very, very difficult to put everything into its proper slot. I've always been a little bit jealous of chemistry with its periodic table of elements, which I find so interestingly asymmetrical and weird. And I've always wanted to create sort of a periodic table of elements for poetry and put everything in its place. But I was unable to do that. Instead, I created what I call a family tree. But the world of poetry is not as difficult as you think. It's just that we've never sort of separated into its different components. And it is true that sometimes some of its components overlap, and that can be a little bit confusing. But generally, I think that there are 5 families in the elements of poetry, and we'll talk about each one of them in order and try to use every poetic term, everything that you could possibly say about a poem. So we start with the first and most important element of poetry, and that is diction. I put a star beside diction because it is essential and non-negotiable. Anytime we look at any poem, we are going to talk about its diction. Now, generally, diction, of course, just means word choice. And generally, we talk about a word's connotations, right? And I often use the metaphor, again, from chemistry, of ions. Every word has either a positive, a negative, or a neutral connotation. Now, we're not very interested in neutral connotations because they don't have a lot of flavor. We're looking for the word that has the most positive connotation or the most negative connotations. We don't want to say silly things about diction when we're talking about a poem, like this poem has lots of diction. We always want to have an adjective in front of that, like positive diction, negative diction, violent diction, meteorological diction, whatever we feel is appropriate to the poem. But we do want to talk about the words that a poet is using. A good question to ask about any poem is, what is the most important word in this poem? What is the poem with the word with the greatest charge? Because the poetry is all about voice and it's all about flavor, and so we need to look for the weirdest word in the poem, the one that's the surprising word, or the word that's usually has this meaning but sort of has a shade of this meaning, because poetry is often like stretching words as far as they can go. So without a question, the most important and the most elemental of the elements of poetry is diction. The second element of poetry, or family of element of poetry, is imagery. And imagery is also starred, with very few exceptions. I can think of a few Roman poems by Catullus that don't have a lot of imagery. Almost every poem has imagery. Imagery is simply when we use words to create images that appeal to a reader's senses. Obviously, the most important in English poetry is visual and auditory imagery, because we are visual and auditory creatures. We're always listening, we're always looking, looking being the most dominant. If we were a dog and we were writing dog poetry, then I'm sure dog poetry is filled with olfactorial imagery, which is imagery of smell. And of course, there's imagery of touch, tactile. And then there's, what's the fifth one? Gustatory, taste. I think that would be pretty big in dog poetry as well. But I often encourage my students to think of types of imagery as well. We might say this poem is filled with blood imagery, war imagery, bird imagery, clothes imagery, weather imagery. We don't need to be locked into these 5 senses. We need to just see if there's something that's in common, like a lot of water imagery, for example, in a poem, and we want to mention that and name it in some ways. Name it and claim it. So diction and imagery, by far, the most important elements of poetry. The third family is what we might call figurative language or figures of speech. And I would say this is non-negotiable. I mean, most poetry at some level uses figurative language, but I don't usually stress that quite as much. But there's the big 5, sometimes I call them the big 6. The most important one is metaphor, and its slight sister simile. They're very similar, sometimes can almost be interchangeably, but metaphor is what I call the heart of poetry. Typically, poems are always moving on a physical level and a spiritual, intellectual, emotional level through the use of a symbol. That would be another type of figurative language. Hyperbole, the exaggeration, personification. A lot of these you've known since you were in elementary school. They're not difficult, but they're very profound in their power as we move through poetry. We also could put paradox up here, and maybe understatement, oxymoron, which is a kind of paradox in some ways. And then there's other obscure ones like metonymy, which I always misspell, sorry about that, and synecdoche. But I don't get too hung up on those because they're often very confusing. And as long as you got pretty much these, you're pretty much doing okay. But we look for figurative language. So diction, imagery, figurative language. Now the fourth one is what I call musical devices. And musical devices, I put an explosion around because musical devices only occur really in poetry. Diction and imagery and figurative languages occur in novels and plays and in prose short stories. Musical devices can occur in those, but they're not intentional. But poetry is a sister to music, and musical devices are often not necessarily meaningful, but they are very beautiful. And musical devices rather irritatingly breaks into three types. One is what I just call similar sounds. And this is where we would find alliteration, consonants, and assonance, which are different uses of the beginnings of the words, the consonants at the beginning of the words, the vowels in the middle of the words, and usually the consonants at the ends of the words. So there's sounds, and then there's rhyme. You know, novels don't rhyme. And there's all types of rhyme. There's end rhyme, there's sight rhyme, there's internal rhyme, there's slight rhyme or near rhyme, which is one of my favorites. There's all sorts of different types of rhyme that you can use. And then there is what we call rhythm and meter, which could be a whole lecture in and of itself, but generally this is where we might put repetition. And we'd also put iambic pentameter in here and free verse. Again, I've done an entire lecture on how iambic pentameter fits into the whole world of rhythm and meter. Again, not necessarily the most significant part of poetry, but definitely a major aspect of poetry. The last section of poetry I simply call structural terms. And there are three different families in this as well. One is just, where we use the terms of poetry, where we say line, verse, stanza, couplet, octave, sestet, and many other terms that you could find out there. The other is types of poetry. These do not have hard forms, but like elegies and parodies and odes and epics and maybe just narrative. These are all just different, and lyric. These are ways to approach the poem. And the final one is what I would call forms of poetry. Now, forms are different than types in that they have very, very strict rules. So a haiku always has 3 lines. A sonnet always has 14. A villanelle always has 19. And these do not change. Whereas a parody could be a sonnet and it's a parody at the same time. Or a parody could be in free verse. So it's more a type of poetry than a form of poetry. Over here in structural terms is where I also like to drop the word juxtaposition, which is such a good word to use in poetry because so much of poetry is setting something against something else, usually in a surprising way. And this is also where I put syntax, which is about the order in which words occur, which strikes me as kind of structural. So these are the 5 elements, families of elements of poetry. And all of these things are used by the poet to create tones and themes. Tones and themes are what I call the meaning of the poem. I don't think that tone is an element of poetry. It is created by the use of these other things. And tone and theme kind of go hand in hand because the theme of the poem, or students like to commonly say, the subject of the poem is love. And so I tend to ask, what is the poet saying about love? And whatever the poet's saying about love, that is its tone. And good poems, of course, usually have one or more tones that are competing with each other. That's kind of the energy that drives the poem, is that there's some sort of paradox or ambiguous approach about the poet toward this particular subject. There are exceptions to that where the poem is entirely in praise or entirely in critique, but typically there's a complexity of tone. At least most of the time on the AP exam there is. One of my favorite sayings about poetry is that metaphor is the heart of poetry, but paradox and a paradoxical tone is where the poem lives. Now, the only thing that I can see that's missing from this is a very deep idea in poetry that can be a tone and can be many other things at the same time, and I just call it irony, and I draw a sort of mean face around it. Because irony is, I don't know, it's beyond my little schema of the 5 elements of poetry, but yet it's a real thing that we need to think about when we read poetry. And there's lots of different levels of irony, at least different at 3. And so it's very hard and very slippery to describe exactly what irony is. So I always make it a frowny face and very puzzling. But every time on the AP exam, basically every prompt is asking us to describe how the poet uses the elements of poetry to create a certain tone or tones and theme. And that's really what poetry is all about. How does the poet create that meaning?